Hey everybody, welcome back. In this video, we're going to start covering for loops. I personally think that these videos are going to start to get a little more interesting because of all the different things we can do with for loops. Loops are an essential part of programming, and you're going to want to make sure you understand them by the end of this video. If you did happen to miss the last video where we covered lists, you can check it out by clicking the link in the top right hand corner of this video, or take a look down in the description. I'll throw a link there too. With all that being said, let's start learning about for loops. To start out, I want us to take a look at the general form of a for loop. To start out, you're going to write for to tell Python that you want to use a for loop. You're going to specify a temporary variable that will be used within this for loop. You're going to say in some sequence. So the sequence could be a list, a string, or there are a few functions that will generate a temporary sequence that you can iterate over. And then all of that will be followed by a colon. Another thing you have to take note, whenever using a statement in Python, or in this case the for loop statement, is you have to tab over every other preceding line to tell Python that that line or the following code is within that for loop and should be executed every time that loop is ran. So every time you have a colon in general, you're going to want to tab it over to let Python know that that specific block of code is within that statement, or the for loop in this case. Alright, so you're going to want to make your way back over to PyCharm as usual. I did grab the two lists that we've been using throughout the series so we can use them later on. To start out, I just want to write a general for loop. So, as I said before, you're going to start off by saying for to let Python know that you're going to use a for loop. You need to come up with some variable to use. I'm going to call mine temporary variable, because it is only temporary and will only be used within this for loop. So later on in your program, you can't reference this variable again because it's only defined for this for loop. Then we're going to say in, and we have to specify the sequence that we want to iterate over. So we can use the numbers and letters list, but to start out, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to use the range function to generate a temporary list, or at least that's how I like to think of it, instead of using the letters and numbers list. So the range function, we're going to start off by specifying the start point. This is included within the temporary list. So I want to start at 0. Then you're going to separate the endpoint by a comma. And this one isn't included within it. So if we're going with the temporary list example, it'll start at 0. And if I want to go from 0 to 9, I'll actually have to place in a 10. So I like thinking of this as making a list from 0 all the way up to 9. And then we're going to place our colon and hit enter. One thing that is nice about PyCharm is that it tabs over for you. If you're using another program and it doesn't tab over for you, you're going to want to make sure you tab over every line that you want to include within the for loop, because if you don't, those lines that you fail to tab over will not be included within your loop. So I want to finish this off by printing out the temporary variable that we have here. So if we type in print and then our temp variable, which is this one that we defined up here. You might not have called it temporary variable, but you're just going to place in whatever you named your variable that you placed here. And we're going to print this out and see what the for loop is doing with the range function. So if we come back up and click run, can bring open the terminal, and we'll see that we get this output from 0 to 9. So essentially what happened here was this range function told Python to run this for loop 10 times, because we have 0 all the way up to 9, but 0 would be included, so that would be 10 times. And every time that it runs this loop, it increases our temporary variable value by 1. So this is a little confusing. We could try a different example. So if we remove the range function up here, let me move this down, and we put in, what is that? And we put in one of our lists up here, so numbers, for example. If we put in numbers, and we keep in temporary variable in our print statement, and we run this. Instead of increasing the value by 1 each time, the for loop is now iterating through the numbers list and printing out each of our elements one by one. So if you take a look, the very first element that was printed was an 8, and if you come up to our numbers list, our very first element that we have in here was an 8, and it'll go through all the way through the list. So one thing that we can do, if we go back to our range function example, so we type in range and we go from 0 all the way to 9. Now we only have 9 elements within here. We don't want to do 10, because if we had in an extra amount of elements, we'll get an error. And then we come down here and we type in numbers, opening, closing brackets, and temporary variable. And if you look at this, you could probably pick apart what's going to happen, because when we used the range function before, we got a list, if you will, of from 0 to 10, but in this case, we'll get it from 0 to 9. And since we're taking this temporary variable and throwing it in here, it's almost as if we were doing, if we typed in numbers and then the index value that we wanted to use. So if we run this, and you'll notice that we get the exact same output as before. This is because the range function is generating a sequence from 0 to 9, and we're taking that sequence and we're placing it in the opening and closing brackets of the numbers list, which acts as the index value, and that'll pull those elements out and print them out to the terminal. Alright, so the next thing that I'd like to cover are nested for loops. And what a nested for loop is a for loop within another for loop. So it'd be like replacing this print statement with the line above it. So to do this, I'm just going to make a few modifications. I'm going to put in for, and we're going to place in another temporary variable, but it can't be the same variable as the one defined above, because this for loop is within another for loop, this one above it, and this variable is already defined. So we have to call it something else. I'm just going to call it var, and then in range. And I only want this one to run 3 times, so I'm going to go from 0 to 3, and then I want the top one to run 3 times as well, so I'm going to go from 0 to 3 again. Colon, and then what I want to do next is print out each of our temporary variables so that we could see what's happening within this for loop. So if we print out var, and actually I want to come up here to print out the temporary variable, we're going to print out temporary variable, and then something that might make this a little bit easier is if we were to come in here and we could say this is loop 1, and we could see what that is, and we'll plus, and don't forget we have to convert this into a string because it is a number. And then we can come down here and do the exact same thing that we did above. So if we call this loop 2, what is that? Loop 2 colon, and then we'll do a plus, and if we convert this one to a string as well because it is an integer value. Alright, so if you look at this, this might be a little complex, a little confusing. This for loop, all this is doing is running 3 times, so it's going to run everything within here 3 times. So it's going to come through, print out the temp variable value, and then it's going to hit this for loop, and then this for loop is going to run 3 times. It has to run 3 times before this for loop above it can run again. To help visualize what's happening a little more, let's take a look at this little animation. You'll see that we have a circle and a ball. The circle represents all the code within the for loop, and the ball represents where the Python interpreter is within that for loop. So when the ball reaches its start point again, that signifies that the ball ran all the code within the loop once. For this first example, we only have one circle. This is a regular for loop, no other loops are within it. Imagine that we just had a for loop that would run only 3 times. So when we run this, you'll notice that the ball goes around the circle, comes back, and repeats it until it goes around 3 times. That's simple enough, right? Now, what about when we have nested for loops? If we take a look at this animation, you'll notice that there are 2 circles. Each circle represents a different for loop. The larger circle, or the first for loop, contains the smaller circle, or the second for loop. You'll see when we run this, all of the code is ran within the first for loop until it hits the second loop. From there, it runs all the contents within the second for loop. Once that finishes, it will then run the remaining code within the first for loop and then repeat. So if we come up and run this, we could kind of take a look at the output and see what's happening. Oh, my bad. Okay. So if we come here, just a little typo. Var. Okay, cool. So if we run this again, there we go. Okay, so we could see, like I said, this for loop comes through and it runs it once, right? So we have loop 1 plus our temporary variable, which should be 0. And that's what we have right here. Then it comes down and it's going to run this for loop next. So you see that we're in loop 2 right here, and we also have a value of 0 because var for the first iteration is a 0. And it comes through and it runs that 3 times like we defined for our range function. And then it comes back up to the top of this for loop and continues this pattern over and over again. Okay, so that's all we needed to cover for loops. For loops can be a little tricky at first. My only suggestion would be to open up PyCharm and just play around with for loops. Create lists, iterate through them, and just try new things. The main thing here is practice. If you practice this enough, it'll all make sense and you'll have a better understanding of what's going on. If you have any questions, don't forget you can leave a comment down below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. See you in the next video.